Hello and welcome to tonight's program. My name is Jessie Jones and I am the Coastwatch Volunteer Coordinator. Coastwatch is a program of Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition, and I just wanted to thank everyone for coming to our presentation tonight with Jean Flemma. For those of you that are new to our webinar series or our webinars in general, Coastwatch is a mile-by-mile beach adoption program along the Oregon coast. You may adopt any mile that you wish. And then Coastwatch is a doorway for connecting you with citizen science researchers and scientists in Washington, Oregon, and California. And we have a basic observation program, but you may join others and create even a richer experience with your Coastwatch mile. If you have any questions about that, my contact information will be at the end of this presentation. And next, I would like to introduce Phillip Johnson, who is the Executive Director of Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition. He'll talk a little bit about Oregon Shores and then introduce Jean. Thanks again for coming. And we will save all of our questions for the end, as usual. You can put them in the chat during if you have a question and you don't want to forget it. You can also use the Q&A. And then also at the end, if you would like to raise your hand, we always like to hear the voices of all of you. So feel free to do that. And Phillip, you're next.
Thanks, Jessie. I'm Phillip Johnson, Executive Director of Oregon Shores. If you didn't know, this is our 50th anniversary year, and we've spent the year hosting a series of talks, all aimed not looking back. We've done very little looking back in this 50th anniversary year. We've been looking forward to the next 50 years of coastal conservation and its challenges. Many of the speakers have dealt with the projected changes in the coast and ocean, which we'll be looking at tonight. Oregon Shores, for those who don't know us, is a comprehensive regional conservation group, by which I mean we address, at least potentially, the full range of conservation topics. We work on land use planning, water quality, shoreline management, marine conservation, endangered species, forest practices, the full range. If you are concerned about the Oregon coastal environment, from the crest of the coastal mountains to the edge of the continental shelf, we would certainly invite you to join with us and help us work to continue to protect the coast for the next 50 years. Go to our website, oregonshores.org, to learn more about us, learn more about Coastwatch. We can always use volunteers for that. A couple of quick pitches for ways to support us in addition to joining. Right now we have our 50th anniversary auction is still going. We also have what we're calling our mile-by-mile competition among donors, choosing which mile they wish to favor. If you go to oregonshores.org, you will find both of those right at the top. So, as I said, the talks we've been sponsoring all year have focused on the impending changes to the coast and ocean and the threats to them. Tonight's speaker is in that vein, but will instead be looking at the future, or at least the hoped for future, of policies that would address some of the issues and threats we've been considering. Jean Flemma is an ocean and climate expert who works at the federal level, but in fact is based here in Oregon. And in fact, she and I have a connection in that we are both on the advisory board of the Alaka Alliance, which is working to restore sea otters, the long extinct sea otter population on the Oregon coast. She's the director of the Ocean Defense Initiative, which works to elevate awareness of ocean and climate issues in Washington, D.C. She's a co-founder of the Urban Ocean Lab, which is a think tank that deals with ocean and climate issues for coastal cities. She also advises foundations and nonprofits working to advance federal policy in these areas. Earlier in her career, she spent many years working in various roles with the U.S. House of Representatives, where she gained experience she now shares with others. This particular talk actually grew out of an article that she co-wrote for the Center for American Progress, which I saw early in the Biden administration. And the article put forth 20 priorities for the Biden administration in addressing ocean and climate and issues and the intersection between those two. And my thought was that this was how the Biden administration might be able to use its power at the federal level to work on those issues. And I thought of flipping that and looking at how people here on the Oregon coast can do their part in those kinds of federal and global level policies. And I contacted Jean, who readily assented to address us. And she seems like the perfect person insofar as she works at the federal level, but is a fellow Oregonian. And so with that, I introduce fellow Oregonian Jean Flemma.
Thank you, Philip. And I'm going to share my screen and hope that I am successful in that effort. This will stop other screen sharings. Yes. Okay. Oh, hold on. Sorry. Excuse me. All right. Are we good? Excellent. Great. So thanks for inviting me, and congratulations to Oregon Shores for celebrating 50 years of advocacy for the Oregon coast and for the recent decision related to Jordan Cove. Congratulations for that. Your leadership is so important, and I look forward to seeing what happens in the years ahead. As Philip mentioned, I live here in Oregon. I live in Portland, but I'm actually coming to you tonight from Manzanita. We drove out today and we're going to be here for the rest of the week, and we spend as much time as we can at the coast. We often drive out just for the day to get our fix. And we're not longtime residents of Oregon. We just moved here in 2018. But Oregon does factor into the very start of my work in ocean policy. When I was a grad student at the University of Washington, I actually wrote my master's thesis on the development of the Oregon Ocean Resources Management Plan that was completed in 1991. So I'm definitely aging myself there. I often have to remind people that Oregon was ahead of the curve when it came to ocean planning, in an effort that was led by State Senator Bill Bradbury, who I'm sure everybody on this call is very familiar with and know very well. And my gracious mentor in my thesis was none other than Bob Bailey, who staffed the Ocean Plan Task Force. And after a long career as the director of the Coastal Management Program, leads, as Philip mentioned, the effort to restore sea otters to the Oregon coast. And so, in fact, it felt like my life came full circle last year when Bob and the Elika Alliance asked me if I would serve on the advisory board with Philip, and it was something that I was honored to do. So as I mentioned, we're here at the coast today. I'm very excited. After grad school, I moved, as Philip mentioned, and spent many years of my career on Capitol Hill. I started out there as a Sea Grant Fellow. Some of you may be familiar with the Sea Grant program. And I worked for 3 different committees and 5 different committee chairs, including Oregon's own Peter DeFazio, who now chairs the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, which has a big role to play in climate change policy looking ahead. In 2015, as Philip mentioned, I left the Hill and started working with nonprofits and foundations, co-founded Urban Ocean Lab, and I direct the project that seeks to elevate champions, ocean champions on Capitol Hill, like Congresswoman Bonamici and Senator Merkley, who are both great champs for us on our issues. So as Philip mentioned, this talk came about when he saw the column that I had written for the Center for American Progress with Dr. Miriam Goldstein and Ann Merwin from Ocean Conservancy, talking about an ocean and climate change agenda for the new administration. And then there was also another article that we had written last December with Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Dr. Goldstein. We wrote an op-ed about the chance for the ocean to be a climate hero in the new administration. A lot of optimism last fall and in January. So as I thought about it, and as Philip asked me to talk about what's ahead in ocean and climate policy and what it means for Oregon and where Oregon Shores and Oregon citizens can play a role, as I thought about it, it occurred to me that as much as Oregon was a leader in ocean planning 30 years ago, the state is still a leader today in a lot of the ocean climate actions that can be seen as a model for other states and also possibly for action at the federal level. And I think that really speaks to the work that organizations like Oregon Shores are doing and will continue to do in the years ahead. So I just first wanted to give a little context. As most of Oregon Shores members know, and I'm sure many people on this call know, the climate crisis is an ocean crisis, and the ocean is the Earth's largest heat and carbon sink. And the ocean has been capturing our global carbon dioxide emissions, and it has been absorbing the heat that is generated and created by those emissions. And in this great graphic that was put together by the Monterey Bay Aquarium and their Associate Research Institute, they show how the impacts of climate change are impacting the ocean through, as we all know here in Oregon, sea level rise, and through coral bleaching, through algae, through ocean acidification, which is a big problem for shellfish growers on the West Coast, and through disruptions to fisheries. A lot of fisheries stocks, particularly on the East Coast, but I'm sure it's happening here on the West Coast as well, are moving north in search of cooler water. So the ocean climate change is having an effect on the ocean. But the ocean also has climate solutions to offer, and that was the subject of the op-ed I had written with Dr. Johnson and Dr. Goldstein. And as we look to the future, advocates, scientists, policymakers are thinking about what those climate solutions need to be and what the ocean can do. But for a long time, the ocean was not part of the climate policy discussions. And it was thanks to scientists like Dr. Jane Lubchenco, who many of you may know from Oregon State University. And she worked with world leaders, and there were advocates in the United States and internationally who led the effort to look at the ocean as integral to climate solutions. And that has really started to gain traction over the past few years, more so than it really had been in the past. And the last meeting of climate negotiations that takes place internationally, this year it's happening in Glasgow. You've probably read about it or heard about it, but the last meeting that happened, COP25, it's called, the Conference of the Parties, or the COP, was labeled the Blue COP to sort of solidify that recognition of the role that the ocean plays in climate change and climate solutions. And this year, the discussion at COP26 in Glasgow will turn to how the ocean can factor into the mitigation and adaptation commitments that countries need to make to address climate change. Here in the US, integrating ocean action into US policy and ocean climate action was somewhat stymied over the last 4 years at the administration level, particularly with at the political level, though career staff in many of the federal agencies obviously were doing all the things that they could do behind the scenes to advance these priorities. But at the political level, that progress was definitely stymied for the past few years. And so advocates and scientists work with Congress to advance many of those ideas. And last year in June, when the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis in the House released their recommendations for addressing climate change, there was an extensive section in there related to natural climate solutions and ocean climate solutions in particular. And this was followed by legislation that was introduced in the fall of 2020 and then reintroduced this year that would implement a series of ocean climate actions at the federal level that could then be implemented not just by federal agencies, but by state and local agencies as well. Oops, excuse me, I'm going to move ahead to the next slide. Oops, there we go. And then with the election of Joe Biden, the opportunity to make ocean climate action an administration priority really came to be. And that was how the op-ed that we talked about first was written, or why it was written. And certainly many people in the advocacy community and the scientific community were making, people that are far smarter than me about these issues, were making the case for the policies that needed to be put in place for the ocean to provide as much as 20% of the emissions reductions that we need globally to help address the climate challenge that we face. And this includes, as you can see in this very nice graphic that my communication staff put together for me, this includes cutting greenhouse gas emissions and expanding offshore renewable energy, increasing ocean resilience to climate change, and protecting the ocean's natural ability to store carbon. But to put any of these targets and goals in place, Congress, the administration, state and local governments are going to have to continue to take action and put new policies in place that will enable us to fully capitalize on the solutions that the ocean has to offer in the climate space. And much of the potential for this action is being discussed right now, at least at the federal level, in the context of a reconciliation package and an infrastructure package, which you can't really turn on the news without hearing about the Build Back Better package or the infrastructure package. And there's a lot of hope that some of the ocean climate action items that we want to see will be included in that package that will then enable states and communities to move forward and put some of these options into play on the ground. So let me see if I can move ahead here to the next slide. There we go. So I'm not very good with my slides today. So the first area where when we talk about ocean climate action, we need to talk about reducing emissions and transitioning to a clean energy economy. And the ocean obviously offers us a lot of opportunities in that regard. And the good news is President has committed to a 50% reduction in US emissions by 2030. And we've rejoined the Paris Agreement in order to fully participate in the international efforts to do that. But this is going to be a very big lift. And as news today from the UN indicates, we have a long way to go to reach those goals. And with that in mind, we want to think about how the ocean helps get us there. And the first thing we need to do is ban offshore drilling. And according to some of the numbers that I've just seen from California Environmental Associates, offshore oil and gas currently accounts for 25% of total global oil and gas production. And I don't need to tell anyone here why we don't need more fossil fuel development in the ocean, or frankly, more fossil fuel development at all. But as we've seen over the past several years, there are still some decision makers that think it makes sense to keep drilling, as evidenced by the plan that was put forth during the last administration to open up every coast to oil and gas drilling. The good news is that states can adopt policies that discourage and disincentivize offshore oil drilling. And no surprise here, Oregon, because they're a leader on these kinds of issues, Oregon has already adopted some of those policies to disincentivize offshore drilling. Thanks in no doubt, thanks. Sorry, it's been a long day, but thanks in part, I'm sure, to the efforts of many Oregon Shores members and some of your partners like Surfrider, who have worked on these issues for quite a long time. And I think in the current administration, I think we all know that there's probably not very much risk that drilling is going to be proposed for the Oregon coast. But without a permanent ban on offshore oil and gas drilling, there's really, we never can be sure that a new fossil fuel friendly administration may come back into power and re-up the proposal that we saw a few years ago. And while the Biden administration did pause new offshore oil and gas leasing on federal lands when they first came into office, that ban has been lifted. And they are now going ahead with a huge lease sale in the Gulf of Mexico next month that has the potential to produce as much as 1 billion barrels of oil. So for Oregon, the state has already adopted policies to disincentivize offshore drilling, but a ban is something that's still important looking forward. And there is in fact a federal ban that has been pending in several legislative packages and is currently being negotiated as part of the reconciliation package that I talked about. And it was added by the House of Representatives. And at first there didn't seem to be as much potential to keep that in the final package, but now with the California oil spill that happened a few weeks ago, there's been a big push from senators, including Senators Merkley and Wyden, to advocate for a ban on offshore drilling on almost every coast, with the exception of certain parts of the Gulf, to be included in this federal package, that's being negotiated. And we don't know yet if it will survive, but that is something that, looking ahead, if it's not in that package, there will be ongoing efforts to secure that in some other format. But at the same time that we reduce emissions from offshore drilling and also from offshore shipping, and shipping emissions have the potential to be a huge problem in greenhouse gas emissions if not checked. So shipping and ports emissions, two areas where there will be more opportunity for reducing emissions. But at the same time, we need to scale up clean offshore energy, renewable energy. And the administration has committed to deploying 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And to meet that goal, several planned leases were outlined last week, lease sales, including one that would take place off the coast of Oregon. But 30 gigawatts of offshore wind is really not that much. And a lot of policy changes will be needed to be adopted both by Congress and by the administration to make that goal a reality, and to go farther if we really want to make offshore wind and other renewable energy an expansive part of our energy portfolio. And this is going to include major upgrades to transmission grids onshore and offshore, and installing transmission lines that can be joined together to avoid the current situation where, when a new project goes into effect, every company is using their own transmission lines, and we need to modernize our grid to minimize that in the future and minimize the impacts that would occur with multiple transmission lines. And then obviously other forms of renewable energy like tidal, and here again is where Oregon is leading the way in the development of offshore tidal energy, with the development of Pac Wave South project that Oregon State is involved in. And looking ahead, like offshore wind, this is going to be another area where major transmission upgrades will be needed to grow tidal energy to scale. And one of the things that I think this is something where I think Oregon Shores and its members and its citizens will have a role to play, is that there's going to be a lot more science and analysis that needs to be done to understand the cumulative impacts that the expansion of renewable energy will have on the marine environment. And the good news is we have the chance to do this right from the start. As this industry grows, we have the chance to look at what the impacts will be and figure out the ways to minimize and mitigate those. And this is an area where I think it'll be really important for groups like Oregon Shores and Coastwatch to work closely with scientists from OSU and Oregon and state regulators and federal agencies to be sure that as we grow this industry, we grow it in the most environmentally and sustainable way possible. So another aspect of ocean climate action that we're, sorry, I'm no problem with there we go. Another area of ocean climate action that is, I think, near and dear to the hearts of Ocean Shores members is protecting what we call blue carbon habitats and ecosystems like salt marshes, seagrass, eelgrass beds, wetlands, kelp. Hello to the sea otters that will help us restore the kelp beds. These coastal habitats have the capacity to store at least 4 times as much carbon as similar habitats on land. And depending on what study you read, I've seen numbers 4 times as much, 5 times as much, 10 times as much. But the good news is that these habitats have the capacity to store significant amounts of carbon. And obviously Oregon Shores members have worked for a long time to protect and restore eelgrass habitats in coastal estuaries. And that I think is something that over time with the sort of expanded look at blue carbon habitats and restoration, there's going to be a lot of opportunity for Oregon Shores and other organizations that want to think about habitat restoration efforts moving forward. Not just for the carbon benefits that they provide, the sequestration benefits, but also for the benefits they provide as fisheries habitat, and also buffering the impacts of sea level rise and storms on land and on coastal communities. And looking ahead, we have the opportunity right now in the reconciliation package that I've been talking about to secure potentially several $billion of federal money to support coastal restoration efforts around the country. And to put this in context, in 2009, Congress appropriated $130 million for coastal restoration projects. And the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration received proposals for $3 billion worth of projects. In this situation right now, we are looking at the potential to secure, and I don't want to jinx it and I don't want to get ahead of it, but as the negotiations proceed, there is the possibility that we could be looking at as much as $7 to $10 million in coastal restoration funding. And if this happens, if we are lucky enough to see this happen in this package, it is in no small part due to the efforts and the leadership of Congresswoman Bonamici, who not only spearheaded this provision, she started supporting this idea more than a year ago, maybe 2 years ago. So not only was she a leader in Congress for this, to secure this money for coastal restoration, but she also convinced the very conservative congressman from Alaska, Don Young, to join her in advocating for this money. So when I say that Congresswoman Bonamici is a champion for us in the ocean, she definitely is. And this is just one example of what she has done. But should this money actually be appropriated, this is going to be a huge opportunity for states like Oregon and for organizations like Oregon Shores to apply for funding to support coastal restoration projects like the eelgrass projects that you're working on, and other projects that can provide the benefits that we've been talking about. And obviously, in addition to restoring coastal habitats, we need to minimize the disturbances to marine and coastal sediments that already contain and have sequestered quite a bit of carbon over time. And that would be released into the atmosphere if they were dredged or developed. So recognizing that this is something that Oregon Shores was probably thinking about when they worked on the Jordan Cove project, as the states and the federal government look to map and think about how they're going to identify high quality blue carbon habitats and how to protect them. This will be another area where your participation and vigilance will be very valuable and important in that process. And finally, ocean climate action means supporting resilient ecosystems and resilient communities. And many scientists have argued that to address our twin crises of climate change and biodiversity, we need to protect 30% of our land and waters by 2030. And as you may know, or you may have heard, President Biden did sign an executive order establishing 30 by 30 as a national goal. And there's a process underway to determine what that means at the federal level. But at the same time, there are some states that are moving ahead with their own 30 by 30 initiatives. California, South Carolina, Hawaii are a few states that have done that. But protected areas are obviously nothing new to Oregon or to Oregon Shores. And Oregon Shores was very active in the participation in the development of the 5 marine reserves that Oregon already has established. And so as the 30 by 30 process moves ahead, And as the Oregon marine reserves that are already established go through their evaluation, this is another area where I think Oregon has been a leader, and it will be an important opportunity for Oregon Shores and for other people that care about this to continue advocating for protected areas, and then also work with OPAC and others and other stakeholders to determine whether expanding protected areas or additional protections are warranted. These are all things that will need to be thought about as this process moves forward. Other ways that we want to create resiliency in the ocean, we want to think about sustainable management of fisheries, because healthy fish stocks are better able to adapt to climate change. And this is another area where the West Coast and Oregon and West Coast, Washington, California have been a leaders. The Pacific Fishery Management Council that manages the fisheries off Oregon, California, and Washington has really been out in front thinking about how climate change is impacting fish stocks and what they need to do to make their management more climate adaptive. But in addition, I do want to give credit to the Pacific Fishery Management Council for the work it has done to rebuild the ground fish stocks off the coast of Oregon and across the West Coast. Those stocks, as many will remember, I think it was maybe in 2000 when the stocks were declared basically a collapse through no fault of the fishing industry and the council, that we just did not have the science. And that was a shock for the managers at the time. But the managers and the fishing industry really did what they needed to do to rebuild those stocks. And they have done an amazing job doing that. And as a result, they have a lot of healthy stocks that will probably be better able to adapt to the changing climate. So I give a lot of credit to the industry and to the council for that. Just quickly, I will mention a few other areas where if we want to think about ocean resiliency, we're going to need to tackle them. And that is not just plastic pollution, which we all think about, and we think about how to, minimize plastic waste, but plastic production is also becoming recognized as a bigger and bigger problem with respect to climate change. And there's just a new study that came out last week that found that plastic production emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions from plastic production, are on track to exceed the greenhouse gas emissions that are produced by coal plants by 2030. And that is mind-boggling to me. And so obviously this is going to be something that, we can't address it just at the state level or the local level. That's going to be something that needs to be addressed at the highest government level, the international level. But if this is something that is of concern to you, that there are ways for us to advocate upwards about the need to address this problem. And I wouldn't be remiss if I didn't touch quickly on ocean acidification, which here on the West Coast, shellfish growers are no strangers to the challenge of ocean acidification, which is being caused by the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions that are being absorbed in the ocean, which make it more acidic. We are very fortunate, again, another example of Oregon as a leader, that scientists from Oregon State and elsewhere have been working with producers and others. And this is an area where I know citizen science plays a role. This is an area where citizens, the industry, scientists from the universities have all come together and really done a very impressive job of studying this and figuring out how to adapt to and mitigate some of these challenges. So with that, I want to talk about what's next, what's coming. And I think the reconciliation deal I mentioned, today, late this afternoon, we heard that the bill could include as much as $500 billion for programs related to addressing climate change. If that's true, this will be the biggest climate bill in history, not just in the United States, but I think anywhere. And that's a pretty good, that is progress, at least in terms of how we're going to address climate change. And the devil will be in the details, as we talked about. And it, of course, what that money actually goes to. Is it going to provide incentives to build up offshore renewable energy? Is it going to provide that coastal restoration money that we talked about? Is it going to help clean up ports and shipping and address other aspects of the emissions challenges that we face that are causing climate change? So the next few weeks, we'll learn a lot more about that. That's a big thing. I think another thing to keep an eye on is the COP26 that I mentioned. These are the negotiations that will be going on in Glasgow over the next 2 weeks. What commitments will the US and other countries make with respect to how they're going to address climate change, both their mitigation commitments and their adaptation commitments, and what ocean commitments will they make in that space? And it'll be incumbent upon us at the state level, at the local level, to make sure that those commitments are kept and implemented. And then in Congress, I think, depending on what does happen in the reconciliation package, there's going to need to be a lot more that needs to be done to help incentivize and further advance the different policy changes that we will need to see to effectively address climate change as we move forward. So that's just a brief overview. That's where I see Oregon really having the chance, and where I see local organizations having a chance to play some roles. But I think we could go into the questions and maybe have a more sort of give and take discussion that would enable us to sort of dig deeper into some of these things, if that makes sense. So I will stop sharing, hopefully. There we go.
Thank you very much, Jean. That was a great overview. Does indeed provoke a lot of questions. So I'll jump in with one.
Okay.
Of course, as an executive director, when anybody mentions money, then I immediately prick up, because that's what you do. So what are your thoughts? You mentioned several times coastal restoration funding, but bringing it right down to the practical level of what would happen in a state like Oregon. What kinds of projects do you see happening, and how would you see an organization like Oregon Shores being involved with that?
Sure. So talking about the coastal restoration money that we are all hoping will be available, there's a couple of things that I think are really important to talk about in the context of that money. One, unlike previous programs that have been funded, this program is not expected to require a match. Often federal grant programs require a match. In this case, the advocates that, and my organization is one of them, the advocates that have been working to secure this money were very focused on making sure that there would not be a matching requirement, because many of the coastal communities that are most in need of coastal restoration work are lower income, sometimes lower income, or communities of color. And often they do not, there has been some studies that have shown they do not have the resources to access that money because they cannot put forward the match. And so I think one of the things that will be very important as this program is developed, again, if we're lucky enough to get this money, is looking at prioritizing where the greatest needs are in terms of where impacts are being felt. So where is sea level rise already causing flooding, like the king tides that your next speaker is going to talk about at your next presentation? Where is that coastal flooding already happening? Where are there communities where the sea level rise is already inundating communities? So part of it will be looking at what types of habitat restoration projects can help buffer some of those challenges that we already see in communities that are being hit first and worst. And as an example, I think, but also at the same time, I think for an organization like Oregon Shores, this is a great opportunity to think about where the eelgrass restoration projects that you're already looking at and have been looking at, but I'm guessing, putting these projects in place is always challenging because you need to get the money to do it. This is hopefully going to be a great opportunity for something like that to get funding, and for the state to look at all the projects that they've already identified for coastal restoration. And many states have already gone through this exercise to think about what are our highest priority coastal restoration projects that we need to put in place. Here on the West Coast, many of them being projects that benefit fisheries habitat, but that also provide some of those other benefits that we talked about, including potentially blue carbon benefits, but then also the sort of the climate impacts buffering benefits. So I didn't really get that specific, but I think it's sort of thinking about it from the big picture, but also the things that you're already working on have the potential to fit right into those, you know, criteria that they're thinking about.
Do you think that they will, that you speak of restoration, but what about, let's say, anticipation, which is to say preparing to adapt for things like sea level rise? For instance, talking about blue carbon, this is a major issue with us, is the potential loss of marshes and wetlands and mudflats as sea level rises if they are trapped against hardened structure and pinched out. So
I do think those kinds of projects will also be prioritized. And in fact, the way the language was written, it was very much about anticipating those types of impacts that you're talking about.
Good. Glad to hear it. So, Jesse, do you have a question you want to raise for us here? Looking in the chat.
Hi. Yes, I just sent a chat that actually is from Jamie Faraday. Hey, Jamie, I'm so glad that you were able to join us tonight. He brings up a really good issue, and I sent that because he sent that just to the panelists, and then I copied and pasted it to everyone. And he's talking about scrutiny of the ports as well. So this is an interesting talking point if we wanted to go anywhere with that. But I would like to also just thank Jean for talking this evening. I am going to segue just for a second, and we can come back to another part of the conversation, to the fact that you brought up OPAC tonight and advocacy with the Ocean Policy Advisory Council. Maybe some of you tonight who are here don't maybe know about OPAC, but in the last maybe couple of years now that I've been with Oregon Shores, and maybe longer, maybe Phillip has, I think, been at least advocating to OPAC or working with OPAC in some way. They are decision-making council for our state with ocean issues. And as some of you may know tonight, we have been working on the new management decisions for some designations of the rocky habitat areas. These are still continuing. We have 6 proposals in continuing consultation, also known now as further evaluations. And if you are interested in that, you can contact myself and Phillip, but we will be resubmitting Oregon Shores as well as Lincoln City Audubon. We'll be resubmitting some of these proposals this year, maybe into next year. It may take a little bit of time. There have been some individuals that they know who they are. I won't mention their names at this point in time, that have been working very hard on actually helping to change the process of evaluations with the state. It's fascinating watching these people work. They're inspiring to me. And so I'm grateful, Jean, for you bringing up OPAC and advocacy. So thank you very much.
And I think, wasn't OPAC established sort of as an like a result of the Oregon Resources Management Plan? Wasn't it sort of, didn't it grow out of that? I can't remember if that's right. Maybe not. Maybe it was more recent than that. But I know it's another, to me, it's another example of how Oregon is a leader in ocean conservation. The fact that OPAC exists, to me, is just another example of that.
Really answer, Phillip?
I don't know specifically if it grew out of that. It's been around, quite a while, and mutated from being from having the agencies actually have votes on it. So it was actually a body that refereed and fostered cooperation among the state agencies. But at a certain point, they no longer had a vote. They're just advisory, and it became a more politicized process, as we've had occasion to encounter in the last year or so.
Yeah. I see a question from Jamie. I'm not sure if I can answer it specifically, but I would say, I think what you're asking, and I apologize if I'm not interpreting it correctly, but you're saying, would a project that is looking to replace wetland functions, would that qualify? And the answer is we don't know until one, this money gets appropriated, hopefully, but then two, the national NOAA will need to sort of lay out the criteria for what projects can apply, but the focus is very much on habitats that will, as I've said, like one, provide blue carbon benefits or carbon sequestration benefits, but also provide habitat benefits, provide sort of that longer term, as you mentioned here, replace wetlands functions. To me, that seems like it would be a project that would be very much in the lane of what they're thinking about. And I think if we're lucky enough to see this program move forward, there will be an opportunity to, in fact, provide input probably into what that program does look like and what the criteria, how they put them into practice. And that will be another opportunity where I think, Oregon Shores and other people here that are interested in it will have the chance to provide input to the agency on what the important types of functions are that need to be replaced or restored here on the coast.
I wonder if I'd like to pick your brain about the possible trade-offs when it comes to developing wind power offshore. More so than with the wave energy, insofar as just because those are smaller. So I'm thinking of two things. There, you mentioned the need for research into the potential impacts on wildlife of wind energy structures. And if people don't know, these structures, the new ones are huge. They're like 2 football field long, the wind sails. So we're talking about potentially a lot of impact if they did affect birds and marine life. But that's not the only trade-off. And so, we're kind of looking with apprehension at the plans or to develop a wind power off Oregon shores, because there's the onshore impacts, because again, wind power facilities are huge and have to be assembled and shipped onshore. And so, we've, as you were kind enough to mention, we've played an important role in blocking the proposed Jordan Cove LNG plant. And while we were opposed to it because of its climate impacts, we were also opposed to it because it would have had a tremendous effect on the Coos Bay estuary through drilling and affecting the habitat there. Well, the wind power facilities, if they're being constructed in Coos Bay, they're going to have a lot of impact, ironically indeed, on the eelgrass, which is
Right.
doing that blue carbon storage you're talking about. So anyway, all I can say is we're looking at this with some nervousness, and I'm wondering what you think.
Sure. Well, I will first say that I am not an expert on offshore wind, and I don't want to pretend to be one. And when I first went to work for Congress, my very first boss said to me, when you go in to brief the chairman, if he asks you a question that you don't know the answer to, don't try and fake it, because he'll know you're faking it. So if you don't know, say you don't know. So in this case, I'm not going to say that I don't know, but I'm going to say that I don't know a lot. So what I will say is that the agencies and the people that I talk to about offshore wind are very upfront about the fact that they also don't know what the potential impacts are, because this is happening so quickly that they have not really fully assessed. And for several years, the agencies weren't being given the direction to make this a priority and the resources to make this a priority. So they don't know what all the impacts are. And that is one of the things that really needs more money, is to study what are going to be the cumulative impacts of not just putting one turbine or 2 turbines, but potentially hundreds of turbines. What does that mean for the the ocean floor, the wildlife that live there. These are, and onshore and offshore, as you said, these are the things that we need to understand, and we need to be looking at them and planning for them and looking for how we're going to mitigate those and minimize those impacts from the start. And I think I mentioned this, but I do feel strongly about this. This is our chance to do it right from the start. And too often, and I think, and it's not just here in the United States, but too often we develop something, we develop an industry, and then after the fact, we think, oh, darn, that was a big mess. Now what do we do? And here we have an opportunity to do it right from the start. And so I think I do know that there has been a lot of money put into the infrastructure bill that's being talked about, which there's two bills right now that are like, everyone wants these two bills. Are we going to pass them at the same time? Are we going to pass one, then the other? But there is a lot of money in the infrastructure bill to support some of that science that needs to be done. But this is another area where I think it's incredibly important for organizations like Oregon Shores to make sure that those questions are being asked, and that we are looking for not just the resources to study what that will be, but how are we going to do it in a way that minimizes those impacts. So I am not an expert on sort of like that broader question of what they all are, but I do think that is a very important conversation that we need to be having, and that organizations like yours can really be supporting those conversations and making sure that they are happening.
Thank you. We do have a couple of more questions. You may see them there in the chat. The first one is from Jan, and the second one from Haley.
Yep, I see Jan's question. I think Jan's question is a really good question. And that is there a national renewable energy plan? And I'm going to say, one, I don't know the answer for sure, but I think the answer is probably no. Because right now, one of the things that I've been hearing from people that are experts on things like offshore wind and other renewable energies is that we don't even have a plan yet for how we're going to build the transmission grid that we were talking about for just offshore wind. And how is that grid going to plug into the onshore grid? And how is our onshore grid and our grid, nationwide going to be updated and modernized to be able to accommodate the renewable energy that we're talking about? So I can't say with 100% certainty, but I think that you are absolutely right. This is something that does need to be much better managed and sort of thought about comprehensively. And I think it's interesting that you bring this up, because in this context, and in the context of ocean and climate actions that we've been talking about, there's a group of us that have been advocating to the administration that we need a plan, a comprehensive plan for how they're going to implement all these different ocean climate commitments that we're making. Like, we're going to get this much offshore wind, we're going to protect this much blue carbon, we're going to do, what's the plan for making sure that all the agencies, all the federal agencies that are responsible for making those things happen, that they're actually working together, sort of in the way that you're alluding to here, to make sure that they're working together in a way that is most efficient, but that also is achieving what we want to achieve in a clear way. So that's not a direct answer to your question, but I think it's very relevant to what's happening right now. And I have to admit, and this is where I'm going to use my training, that I don't know, like, I am not the expert to answer Haley's question. I feel like, are we expecting to see localized ecosystem change? I mean, we definitely are already seeing those changes. And as I mentioned, for instance, fisheries on the east and west coast are moving north because they're looking for cooler water. But I don't necessarily think I can answer sort of that larger question about how they're going to acclimate and what the outcomes will be of that. So I apologize that I can't be more specific there. And then Jan put in a nice link about offshore wind in Oregon, so that's good. And I think Jamie was offering a comment, not necessarily a question, if I read that right.
Yeah, and everyone here can see that in the chat. And then I think
Yeah.
that Jamie put that, it was kind of a response, and it's good conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So do we have any more questions this evening? I'm not seeing any hands raised at this time. It's a wonderful presentation, Jean. Thank you.
Sure. I was wondering if you wanted to talk briefly about Coastwatch advocacy issues, or do you want to? Okay.
Sure. Yeah, we have a thanks for reminding me. So yes, Coastwatch, as I was talking about with you before the program started this evening, before all of you came into the room, we have been, I think, starting in 2020, kind of encouraging our volunteers to become ocean advocates, to become beach advocates, to use their voice as they can. We have numerous opportunities in which to do that. There are ways that you can speak up for your local communities. There are ways that you can speak up regionally as well. And one of the things that I love about my job is working for Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition, which is the umbrella organization, is what they do for our state and for our coast, and also what our volunteers can do. And we've been I don't know how to really put this, but given more freedom as of late with some of the work that we are doing with Coast Watchers, and just, I guess I'll just say again, just encouraging advocacy, letter writing, speaking up. And yes, I would love to know what you have to say about that, Jean.
Well, so I think what we were talking about is you're engaging or embarking on a campaign to think more about how you influence decision makers through emails or phone calls or letters, and or other. So a lot of people now are using social media as a way to influence decision makers. I myself finally forced myself to be a Twitter person and use that as a way for influencing decision makers. I fought it for a long time, but I finally I gave up, or I gave in, I guess I should say. But as somebody who worked for Congress for more than 20 years, and I worked for many different members of Congress, I know I often hear from people that they don't think writing a letter or making a phone call, or that they don't think it matters, and that they don't think that, they're not going to listen to me. And I just want to say that that is not true. And in fact, I had one boss who said, if I get 10 letters, I want to know what the hell is going on. Something's going on. And so I just like to reiterate that with people when I'm talking to them, because I think it's important to know that it's sometimes hard to think about how our voice measures up against industry and the money that gets poured into some things and into some of these fights. And that's why it's that much more important for your voice to be elevated in whatever format you choose to do that, whether it as is a phone call, a letter, social media, an email. Don't give up when you think that those interests are too overwhelming. Instead, take action, because it does matter. And I just like to always say that, because I lived it and I've seen it, and it does.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
And there are opportunities, not just with Oregon Shores and Coastwatch, of course, but a lot of conservation partners along the coast. Surfrider is a big one as well.
Surfrider, you mentioned Audubon, your local Audubon, which is very active, and these are the organizations that are making it happen, right?
Yes, yeah.
And Oregon Shores for 50 years.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
I also ran a small nonprofit for a few years that recently celebrated its 50th anniversary. And I know, first of all, how hard it is to run a small nonprofit. So the fact that small nonprofits exist and function and do good work is a testament to its staff, but also to its membership and the people that put their, give their time to make that progress happen.
Absolutely. Thank you. And there will be plenty of opportunities in the next 3 or 4
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So speaking of opportunities, let's put in another plug for our talk next week, in that participating in the King Tides project is a way to get your foot into the door here, because the goal of the King Tides project is to trace the highest reach of the highest tides of the year now as a preview to what typical tides will be, depending on what we do to abate climate change. And so it's a citizen science project that plays directly into understanding the impacts of climate change. And our speaker next week on Wednesday, Marina Saras, helped to found that international project, and we'll be talking about what we're learning about the tides now and the tides in the future. So again, take a look at the OregonShores.org site and consider joining us next week.
Thank you.
And for that matter, participating in the King Tides project.
Yes, thank you. And also what's very interesting is more and more what we have are scientists and leaders working together to create policy based on that data that is coming from the King Tide. So it's very interesting. Local policies, managed retreat, that kind of thing. So yeah.
And I mean, obviously managed retreat is something that we didn't really talk about today, but that is an issue that at the federal level, we suffer from no one federal agency being in charge of that, of managed retreat. And so as a result, how we're going to address it from the federal level is not clear. And so the local work that's being done is one, like the work with this King Tides project, but the local work that's being done to figure out how to address that is ultimately probably going to serve as a model for what happens looking upwards. And I think
yes,
that is something that nobody wants to talk about it, but we have no choice. And so the fact that local organizations are already thinking about how to address it, they shouldn't have to do it on their own, but they know that it has to be done and they're doing it.
Right. It's a fascinating example of grassroots citizen science, I think. I'm really looking forward to the talk next week and to see how
it sounds like a very, very interesting conversation.
Yeah, it will be great. Well, thank you. We are at 3 minutes past the top of the hour, and I want to thank everyone who has come and is.
Thanks for coming. And if anyone has any questions for me, it's my name at Gmail. Feel free to shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer them. And
great. I'll put that in the chat right now. And I'm also going to put my email as well. If we do have any folks here tonight who are not Coastwatchers, really glad that you're here. If you're not Oregon Shores members, really glad that you are here. If you
join Oregon Shores. Join Coastwatch.
And
thank you. We didn't pay her to say that either.
This small organizations are where it's at.
Thank you so much, Jean. It was a wonderful
evening. Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Have a good night. Thanks for coming. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jean.